You know me as the coward, the betrayer, the one who fled when the bronze gates of Cathara shattered like autumn leaves beneath the warhammers of the northern horde. History will remember me as Thymon the Oathbreaker, the captain who abandoned his post, who left his brothers to die while their wives and children screamed from the burning towers behind us. But history, my friend, is written by those who were not there when the gods themselves walked among the corpses, when the very stones wept blood, and when I discovered that sometimes the greatest act of courage is to be branded a coward for all eternity. I tell you this now, in my final hour, as the poison spreads through my veins like winter fog through a valley. The same poison I mixed into my wine tonight, because there are some truths too terrible to carry to a natural grave. Listen well, for this is the last testimony of a man who has carried the weight of divine command for 47 years, and who has watched empires crumble knowing he could have prevented their fall with a single word, a word I was forbidden to speak. They say I was born under an ill star, that my mother wept when I drew my first breath, because the crows had gathered in her birthing chamber. But the truth is stranger still. I was born under no star at all. The night of my birth, every constellation vanished from the sky for 3 heartbeats, and in that cosmic silence, something ancient and patient turned its gaze toward our world. The midwives spoke of it in whispers, how the darkness seemed to lean into their chamber, how the shadows grew long fingers that caressed my infant face before retreating to whatever realm spawned them. My childhood was marked by visions that came not in dreams but in the spaces between thoughts. I would see vast battles fought with weapons that had not yet been forged, hear the death songs of heroes whose names had not yet been spoken. By my 15th year, I could predict which of our cattle would die before winter, which crops would fail before the seeds were planted, which of our neighbors would not see another spring. The village elders called it a gift. I called it a curse, for knowing the future is a hollow blessing when you are powerless to change it. But I was not powerless. That revelation came to me on the eve of my 20th birthday, when the god appeared in my father's stable. You must understand, when the divine manifests in our world, it does not arrive with trumpets and golden light as the poets claim. It comes like a wound opening in reality itself, like the moment when you realize you have been holding your breath for so long that your lungs have forgotten how to work. The god wore the face of a beggar, filthy and scarred, with eyes that held the memory of every star that had ever died. When it spoke, its voice was the sound of empires falling. Thymon of the Northern March, it said, and hearing my name in that voice was like swallowing shards of ice. You have seen what is to come, the great war that will devour kingdoms, the march of armies that will turn rivers red and make orphans of entire cities. You have witnessed the death of ages. I fell to my knees in the straw, my body trembling not from fear, but from the terrible weight of divine attention. Lord, I have seen these things in fragments, in glimpses. You have seen enough, the god interrupted. The question is not what you have witnessed, but what you will choose to do with the burden of sight. I offer you a choice, son of prophecy. You may prevent the war. You may speak the words that will turn the northern tribes away from our borders. Convince the king to sign the Treaty of the 7 Seals. Unite the fractured clans under a single banner of peace. You have the gift of persuasion when you choose to use it, the silver tongue that could make heroes of cowards and cowards of heroes. Speak, and save your people. The hope that bloomed in my chest was like a flower opening in the heart of winter. Yes, I whispered, tell me the words, tell me what I must do. The god smiled, and in that smile I saw the trap. But know this, Thymon the Peacebringer, Thymon the Savior, if you prevent this war, if you speak the words of peace, and save these countless lives, you will damn something far greater. The war you see approaching is not the true darkness. It is the forge in which heroes are made, the crucible that will birth the warriors needed for a battle yet to come. 27 years hence, when the gates of the underworld crack open and the dead pour forth like a black tide, there will be no champions to stand against them. The heroes who would have been tempered in the coming war will instead have grown soft in peace. They will fall like wheat before the scythe, and not just your kingdom, but all kingdoms, all peoples. All life itself will be consumed by an darkness that makes your approaching war seem like a children's game. I stared at the god in horror, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. You're asking me to choose between thousands of lives now and the entire world later. I am not asking, the god replied. I am commanding. You will let the war come. You will say nothing of the treaty, nothing of the words that could prevent it. You will watch good men die and children starve and women weep. And you will know that with a single speech you could have stopped it all. This is the price of sight, Thymon. This is what it means to serve a greater purpose. And if I refuse, I asked, though I already knew the answer. Then you will speak your pretty words and save your pretty kingdom. And in 27 years you will watch as everything you love is devoured by horrors beyond imagination. The choice is yours, but choose knowing that either path leads through an ocean of blood. The only question is whether that blood serves a purpose." The god vanished then, leaving only the smell of rain on Summerstone and the terrible knowledge that burned in my skull like a brand. I knelt in that stable until dawn, weeping for the future I had seen and the choice I had already made. For what kind of man chooses the death of thousands to save millions? What kind of hero becomes the villain in every story that will be told about him? But I made my choice. I held my tongue when King Aldric's messengers arrived with news of the northern tribes' willingness to negotiate. I said nothing when the War Council debated sending envoys to the Treaty of Seven Seals. I watched as the chance for peace slipped away like water through cupped hands, and I bore the weight of every soul that would die because of my silence. The war came as I had seen it would. The northern tribes swept down from their mountain strongholds like wolves in winter, their war chants echoing across frozen valleys. They brought with them weapons forged in the deep fires of their homeland, blades that could cleave through shield and mail as if they were silk. Our armies met them at the crossroads of Torn Banner, and the battle lasted 3 days and 3 nights, until the ground was so thick with blood that the surviving horses refused to walk upon it. I fought in that battle, led a company of 200 men against odds that should have broken us before the first charge. But I had an advantage none of the other captains possessed. I had seen how the battle would unfold. I knew which flanking maneuver would fail, which charge would break through enemy lines, which of my men would die and which would live. Using that knowledge, I kept more of my company alive than should have been possible, though each life I saved felt like another weight added to the scales of cosmic justice. The war raged for 3 years. Cities fell and rose again. Heroes emerged from the carnage, their names carved in legend by the very suffering I had allowed to continue. Gareth the Iron-Handed learned courage in the Siege of Broken Crown, where he held a breach in the wall against impossible odds for 6 hours while civilians fled through the tunnels below. Alina Swiftarrow discovered her gift for leadership when her captain died at the Battle of Weepingstone, and she rallied a scattered force of survivors into the disciplined company that would later break the siege of Whitehaven. Marcus the Bold, who would have lived a quiet life as a blacksmith in peacetime, forged his first legendary weapon from the broken swords of fallen enemies during the long winter of the Northern Retreat. Each hero's birth came at the cost of 100 ordinary deaths. Each legend began with a tragedy I could have prevented with a handful of words. The weight of that knowledge nearly broke me a dozen times, but the god's command held me fast. I was not permitted to speak the truth, not allowed to seek absolution through confession. I carried the secret alone, watching as my reputation changed from promising young captain to reliable veteran to grizzled survivor to the bitter old commander who sent men to die with apparent callousness. For you see, when you know the future, when you understand which sacrifices must be made for the greater good, you begin to look like a man who cares nothing for human life. When I ordered a charge that I knew would cost 40 lives but save the battle, when I abandoned a position that could have been held at the cost of every man under my command, when I made the hard choices that a normal commander would agonize over, I appeared cold, calculating, inhuman. My men began to whisper that I valued victory more than their lives. They were wrong, but I could not tell them so. The truth would have been crueler than their suspicions. The war ended, as I knew it would, on the plains of Sorrow's End. The northern tribes, their strength finally broken by the heroes that the war itself had created, sued for peace on terms that favored neither side. The treaty was signed with pens dipped in the blood of the fallen, and the survivors limped home to rebuild what they could from the ashes of what they had lost. I was 37 years old, a decorated veteran with 3 major victories to my name and the secret knowledge that I had doomed thousands to death for the sake of millions yet to be born. The peace lasted 24 years, good years, mostly, though haunted ones for those of us who had seen too much of war. The kingdom prospered. Children grew to adulthood without knowing the taste of siege bread or the sound of war horns in the night. The heroes that the war had forged became the pillars of our society. Gareth became Lord Marshal of the Eastern March, Alina founded the Academy of Strategic Arts, Marcus established the Guild of Artificers that would revolutionize our weapons and armor. They were ready, though they did not know for what. I spent those years training the next generation of warriors, passing on what knowledge I could without revealing its source. I became known as a harsh teacher, demanding perfection in sword work, ruthless in combat exercises, obsessed with preparing my students for battles that seemed impossibly unlikely in our peaceful kingdom. They thought me a relic of a more violent age, unable to let go of old wars. If only they had known I was preparing them for the war to end all wars. The signs began 3 years before the prophesied date: livestock born dead or twisted, wells running dry despite abundant rain, crops withering in fields despite rich soil and perfect weather. The earth itself seemed to sicken, as if something poisonous was seeping up from the deep places. The wisest of our scholars began to suspect that something was wrong, but they attributed it to natural cycles, unusual weather patterns, perhaps some distant volcanic eruption affecting our climate. None of them imagined that the underworld itself was beginning to crack open like an egg. I knew, I had always known. In 2 years and 43 days, the dead would rise. Not as the shambling corpses of children's nightmares, but as they had been in life, armed and armored and filled with a terrible purpose. They would pour forth from burial mounds and forgotten battlefields, from crypts and charnel houses, led by the greatest warriors of ages past, and at their head would march the Shadow King himself, the first death, the darkness that existed before light was born. But our kingdom was ready. The heroes forged in the war I had allowed to happen had trained a generation of warriors, harder and more capable than any who had come before. Our weapons were stronger, our armor more cunning, our tactics more refined. We had learned from 3 years of brutal warfare how to fight against impossible odds. The Academy of Strategic Arts had studied every major battle in recorded history and developed new approaches to warfare. The Guild of Artificers had created weapons specifically designed to harm creatures that should not exist in our world. All of this preparation had been unconscious, driven by the dim understanding that peace was temporary, that greater challenges lay ahead. But it was not enough. Even with all our preparations, even with our legends and our heroes and our superior equipment, the coming battle would be decided by a single factor: leadership. And that, I realized with growing horror, was why the god had chosen me for this burden. The dead do not fear death, for they have already passed through it. They cannot be demoralized, cannot be rooted, cannot be convinced to surrender. They can only be destroyed, and that requires a commander willing to spend lives like coins to sacrifice pawns for strategic advantage to make the brutal calculations that win wars at costs no decent person should be willing to pay. It requires someone who has already proven he can watch good men die for the greater good. Someone who has been branded a monster so that when the time comes to be monstrous in service of life, he will not hesitate. It requires someone like me. The understanding came to me slowly, like dawn creeping over a battlefield. The god had not simply asked me to allow a war for the sake of creating heroes. It had been preparing me as well, forging me in the same fire that had created Gareth and Elena and Marcus and all the others. Every choice I had made, every life I had spent, every moment I had appeared heartless and calculating all of it, had been shaping me into the commander who could win the unwinnable war. I was not just the instrument of others' heroism, I was being prepared for my own. But there was a price still to be paid. There is always a price. The final test came at the siege of Kithara 3 months before the prophesied rising. The northern tribes, unified under a new warlord who called himself the Crimson Bear, had violated the treaty and swept south in a campaign of conquest that caught everyone by surprise. Everyone, that is, except me. I had seen this too, in the visions that still came to me in the spaces between heartbeats. The siege was necessary. It was the final forge in which the last group of heroes would be tempered. But it would only work if I played my assigned role perfectly. The siege lasted 6 weeks. The northern horde surrounded Kithara with a ring of steel and fire, cutting off all supply lines, all hope of reinforcement. Inside the city walls, 30,000 civilians huddled in fear, while barely 8,000 defenders held the ramparts against odds of more than 3 to 1. I commanded the eastern wall, the strongest section of our defenses, with a force of 2,000 of our best soldiers. For 5 weeks, we held. The northerners hurled themselves against our walls in wave after wave, and we threw them back with volleys of arrows, cauldrons of burning oil, and the disciplined courage of men fighting for their homes. My section of wall never faltered, never gave ground, never showed weakness. My men began to believe we could hold indefinitely, that reinforcements would eventually arrive, that the siege would break itself against our determination. I knew better. I had seen how this ended. On the morning of the 42nd day, the northern shamans would complete their ritual. The great rams they had been carving in the deep forest would be invested with the spirits of ancient giants, and those rams would break the bronze gates as if they were made of parchment. The horde would pour into the city. and in the chaos that followed, heroes would be born. But only if I played my part, only if I ran. The morning came as I had foreseen it. The shamans emerged from their forest camps, carrying rams carved from trees older than memory. And as they chanted their binding spells, the wood began to glow with an inner fire. The spirits of the ancient giants, the first enemies of mankind, descended into those rams like lightning striking the earth. When the shamans pointed their weapons toward our gates, I felt the cosmic machinery of fate grinding into motion. This was my moment. Everything I had done, every choice I had made, every life I had spent or saved, had led to this single decision. I could stay and die with my men, die a hero's death that would save no one and doom everyone. Or I could do what the god had prepared me to do. I could become the villain in every story that would be told about the fall of Cathara, so that heroes greater than myself could rise from the ashes of my reputation. Pull back, I ordered my lieutenant, a young man named Darius, who looked at me as if I had asked him to murder his own mother. Sir, you heard me. Pull the men back from the wall. We're retreating to the secondary positions. But sir, the gates, if we abandon the wall, they'll be able to concentrate all their power on the gates without worrying about flanking fire from our position. The gates will fall within the hour. I met his stare without flinching. Those are my orders. What I could not tell him was that the gates would fall anyway, that our arrows could not harm. Creatures invested with giant spirits, that staying would accomplish nothing except ensuring that my best soldiers died uselessly, instead of surviving to fight in the battles to come. What I could not explain was that the fall of Cathara was necessary, that from its ashes would rise the final generation of heroes needed to face the army of the dead. Darius's face went white. Sir, there are 30,000 civilians in this city, women, children. If the gates fall, the gates will fall whether we hold this wall or not, I said. And that at least was truth, though not the whole truth. What matters is preserving our force for the battles ahead. What battles? Darius demanded. If we lose the city, there won't be any battles ahead. There will only be graves. I wanted to tell him about the rising dead, about the Shadow King, about the war for the survival of all living things that would begin in less than 3 months. I wanted to explain that the 30,000 civilians in Cathara were already doomed, that the best I could do was ensure their deaths served a purpose. I wanted him to understand that I was not a coward, but a man making the hardest choice in human history. Instead, I drew my sword and pointed it at his chest. You have your orders, Lieutenant. Carry them out, or I'll find someone who will. The look in his eyes in that moment haunts me still. I watched respect die, watched admiration curdle into disgust, watched a young man who had followed me faithfully for 3 years realize that his commander was a monster. He saluted stiffly, turned away, and began giving the withdrawal orders. Within minutes, the word had spread along the wall. Thymon the Oathbreaker was abandoning his post. The eastern wall was being evacuated. The gates were doomed. We pulled back to the secondary positions as the enchanted rams struck the bronze gates. The sound was like the world breaking, a metallic shriek that seemed to go on forever. On the third blow, the gates shattered, and 25,000 northern warriors poured into Cathara like a tide of steel and fury. What followed was a massacre, but not the massacre anyone expected. Instead of simply slaughtering the defenders and civilians, the northerners found themselves trapped in narrow streets where their superior numbers meant nothing, caught in a maze of prepared positions and carefully planned ambushes. The withdrawal I had ordered had not been a retreat, it had been a regrouping. My men, along with the other survivors of the war, had pulled back to positions where they could fight more effectively, where they could use their knowledge of the city to offset the enemy's advantage in numbers. The battle raged for 3 days through the twisted streets of Cathara. In those 3 days, legends were born. Darius, my former lieutenant, held the Bridge of Sorrows for 6 hours with only 20 men, long enough for 2,000 civilians to escape through the river tunnels. When he finally fell, he had personally killed 14 northern champions and wounded twice that many. Captain Helena of the West Gate died, leading a charge that broke through enemy lines to rescue 50 children trapped in the Temple of the Sun. Her sacrifice became the stuff of song, and her tactics were studied at military academies for generations to come. Sergeant Marcus Ironhand, not the same. Marcus, who became famous in the earlier war, but a distant cousin discovered he could forge weapons even in the middle of battle, creating enchanted blades from the broken swords of the fallen and distributing them to anyone who could wield them. By the third day, the northern horde had been reduced to barely 8,000 effective fighters, and they were facing 3,000 defenders. who had been transformed by the crucible of street fighting into the most effective urban warriors in the kingdom's history. The Northerners, realizing they had won a hollow victory at a cost they could not afford, withdrew from the city and retreated to their mountain fastnesses. Cathara was saved, though at a cost of 27,000 dead, and the city reduced to rubble and ash. I survived, of course. The god's command protected me even as it damned me. I led the final charge that broke the northern line and drove them from the city, but by then my reputation was already fixed. I was Thymon the Oathbreaker, the commander who had abandoned the wall and doomed the gates. The fact that my withdrawal had actually saved the city by allowing for more effective defensive positions was lost in the simpler story of cowardice and betrayal. History, as I had learned long ago, is written by those who were not there when the choices had to be made. The heroes of Cathara went on to become the final pieces in the great game the god had been playing. Darius, had he lived, would have become the greatest military tactician of his generation. Helena's disciples founded the Sacred Order of Urban Defenders, whose techniques proved invaluable in the street fighting that followed the rising of the dead. Marcus Ironhand's innovations in battlefield forging gave our armies the enchanted weapons they needed to harm creatures that existed partially outside our world. 3 months later, on a night when the moon turned black and the stars seemed to weep tears of silver, the earth cracked open and the dead began to rise. They came first from the ancient battlefields, from places where blood had been spilled in quantities so vast that it had soaked into the very bedrock. The plain of broken spears vomited forth 10,000 skeleton warriors, still bearing the arms and armor they had carried in life. The valley of silent screams released the spirits of those who had died in agony, twisted by their suffering into creatures of pure malice. From the tomb of the first kings came the ancient rulers themselves, still wearing their crowns of tarnished gold, still commanding the loyalty of armies that should have crumbled to dust centuries ago. But the worst was yet to come. On the third night of the rising, the Shadow King himself emerged from the deepest places of the earth, from caverns that existed before the world had shape or meaning. He was not dead, for he had never truly lived. He was the absence of life, the void that existed before creation began, the darkness that will remain when the last star burns out. Where he walked, plants withered and died, animals fell as if struck by lightning, and even the air itself seemed to grow thin and cold. He brought with him armies beyond counting, not just the human dead but the corpses of every creature that had ever drawn breath. Wolves and bears and great cats with eyes like dying coals, dragons, whose bones still held the memory of fire giants from the elder days. When the world was young and terrible things walked beneath an alien sky, they marched in formations that had not been seen since the creation wars, following banners that bore symbols painful to look upon. Our kingdom, along with every other realm of the living, mobilized for a war unlike any that had ever been fought. But we had advantages that our enemies could not have anticipated. The heroes forged in the wars I had allowed to happen, tempered in conflicts I had refused to prevent, led armies that fought with a skill and determination that bordered on the supernatural. The weapons crafted by the Guild of Artificers could harm creatures that should have been immune to mortal steel. The tactics developed at the Academy of Strategic Arts proved effective even against enemies that felt no pain and knew no fear. And we had me. I was named Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, not because anyone trusted me. My reputation as the Oathbreaker preceded me wherever I went, but because I was the only commander who seemed capable of making the brutal decisions that victory required. When the coastal cities were overrun by drowned dead rising from the sea, I ordered them burned to prevent the contagion of undeath from spreading, even though thousands of living civilians were still trapped inside. When the Dragoness Gate Pass was held by a legion of skeletal horsemen, I sent a division of our best cavalry in a charge I knew would fail because their noble sacrifice would inspire 3 other divisions to fight with the fury needed to break through. I spent lives like a merchant spends coins, always calculating the cost against the gain, always choosing the path that saved the most people even when it meant sacrificing some. My commanders thought me heartless. My soldiers believed I cared nothing for their lives. The civilian population whispered that I was in league with the Shadow King himself. But the war ground on, and slowly, impossibly, we began to win. The final battle took place on the Plain of Last Hope, a stretch of grassland that had been chosen specifically because it offered no advantage to either side. There, under a sky the color of old blood, the last army of the living faced the ultimate host of the dead. 1 million souls who still drew breath stood against 10 million who had forgotten what breathing meant. I deployed our forces with a cold precision that had made me infamous, The heroes of previous wars, those who had survived the decades of conflict I had orchestrated, led their units with skills honed by a lifetime of impossible battles. Gareth the Iron-Handed commanded our heavy cavalry, his horsemen striking like thunderbolts where the enemy line was weakest. Elena's disciples held the center, their disciplined formations an unbreakable wall against which wave after wave of the dead broke and fell. Marcus's weapons sang as they cut through creatures that should have been immune to mortal steel, each blade enchanted with the fury of the forge and the memory of those who had fallen. But the true battle was not fought between armies. It was a duel between myself and the Shadow King, a contest not of swords but of wills. For I had finally understood the full scope of the god's plan, the reason I had been chosen for this burden, the price I was truly expected to pay. The Shadow King was not simply the Lord of the Dead. He was the embodiment of ending, the force that brought conclusion to all stories. He existed to ensure that nothing lasted forever, that all things must eventually pass into darkness. In the cosmic balance, his role was as necessary as birth, as essential as growth, as essential as growth, as inevitable as time itself. He could not be truly defeated, only delayed, held at bay for another age, until the wheel of existence turned and brought him forth again. But delay was enough, delay was everything. If I could hold him back for even a single generation, if I could buy time for the world to rebuild, to grow strong, to prepare for his next rising, then everything, all the deaths I had allowed, all the suffering I had caused, all the heroism I had purchased with innocent blood would have been worth it. The duel lasted 3 days and 3 nights. We fought not with weapons but with words, each of us reciting the deeds that gave us the right to claim victory. The Shadow King spoke of entropy and endings, of the peace that comes when all struggles cease, of the mercy of final rest. I answered with tales of the heroes whose births I had midwifed, through war and suffering, of the courage that blooms in the darkest hours, of the love that inspires mortals to sacrifice everything for strangers they will never meet. For 3 days I held nothing back. I told him about Darius, who died to save children he had never seen before. I spoke of Helena, who charged into certain death because someone had to, and she refused to let it be anyone else. I recited the names of 1,000 heroes, great and small, men and women whose legends I had paid for with blood and conscience, whose stories proved that life was worth preserving no matter the cost. On the dawn of the 4th day, the Shadow King bowed his head and spoke the words that I had waited 47 years to hear. You have proven your case, Commander of the living. I withdraw my forces for this age, though I will return when the wheel turns again. But know this, the price you have paid has changed you. You are no longer entirely mortal. The blood on your hands has made you something other, something between life and death. You may have won this battle, but you cannot return to the world you fought to save. He was right. When I looked at my reflection in the polished surface of my sword, I saw that my eyes had become the color of winter storms, that my hair had gone white as bone, that my face bore lines carved by decades of impossible choices. More than that, I could feel the weight of all the deaths I had caused pressing against my soul like stones at the bottom of a deep well. I had become something that belonged neither to the world of the living nor the realm of the dead. The armies of darkness faded like mist before the morning sun, returning to whatever deep places had spawned them. Our soldiers cheered and wept and sang songs of victory, but I felt nothing except the terrible hollowness that comes when a lifelong purpose is finally fulfilled. The war was over, the world was saved, and I was utterly, completely alone with the knowledge of what I had done to achieve that salvation. I resigned my command that same day and disappeared into the wilderness, seeking some place where the weight of memory might be bearable. For 47 years I have wandered the edges of the world, watching from afar as the kingdoms I saved rebuilt themselves as new heroes rose to face smaller threats. As the children born after the war grew to adulthood, never knowing how close they had come to never existing at all, I have seen Gareth's son become Lord Marshal in his father's place, watched Elena's academy train a new generation of tacticians, observed as Marcus's guild produced wonders of artifice that pushed back the boundaries of what was possible. The world grew bright and beautiful and peaceful, everything I had hoped it could become when I first accepted the god's bargain so long ago. But I could not be part of that beauty. The choices I had made, the blood on my hands, the knowledge of how much innocent suffering I had allowed, all of it separated me from the world I had saved as surely as if I had died on that ancient battlefield. I was the ghost at the victory feast, the shadow cast by triumph, the price that had to be paid for every sunrise. Tonight, as I feel the poison working its way through my body, I find myself thinking not of the great deeds or the cosmic battles, but of simple things. The sound of children laughing in a marketplace. The sight of farmers working fields that will never again be soaked with blood. The knowledge that somewhere, lovers are making promises they will actually be able to keep. That parents are tucking children into beds, those children will wake up in that. Tomorrow will come for all the people who never knew how close it came to not arriving at all. This is my victory. This is my reward. Not glory or recognition or forgiveness, but the simple fact that the world continues, that life persists, that the choices I made, terrible as they were, served a purpose larger than my own damnation, that God spoke truly when it said that serving a greater purpose requires sacrifice. What it did not say was that sometimes the greatest sacrifice is not your life, but your soul. Sometimes being a hero means accepting that history will remember you as a villain. Sometimes saving the world means damning yourself so completely that you can never be part of the world you saved. I am Thymon the Oathbreaker, and I have kept faith with an oath so terrible that breaking it would have been the greater sin. I am the coward who ran so that others could be brave, the villain whose evil gave meaning to their heroism, the monster who became monstrous so that others could remain human. I am the last chronicle of the war against ending, and with my death, the secret of that war dies too. Let history remember me as it will. Let the bards sing of heroes who were truly heroic, who faced their trials without foreknowledge, who chose correctly because their hearts were pure rather than because they had seen the consequences of choosing wrongly. Let the world I saved never know the full price of its salvation, never understand that sometimes the greatest acts of love require the appearance of perfect hatred. The poison is almost finished with me now. I can feel my heartbeat slowing, my breath growing shallow, my thoughts beginning to scatter like leaves in an autumn wind. Soon I will join the God who gave me this burden, and perhaps in whatever realm awaits those who serve purposes beyond their own understanding, I will find the peace that has been denied to me in this life. But before I go, let me speak one final truth, the most important truth of all. It was worth it. Every drop of blood, every sleepless night, every moment of agony and guilt and self-hatred, all of it was worth it for the simple fact that the sun rose this morning on a world where children can grow up to be heroes, by choice rather than necessity, where the dead stay decently buried, where the darkness knows its place and keeps to it. I have been the villain in every story told about me, and I would make the same choices again. This is what it means to serve something greater than yourself. This is what it costs to save the world. And now, as the last light fades from my eyes, I can finally rest in the knowledge that the world I saved will never understand what I did for it. That, perhaps, is the greatest victory of all.